In this session, we're going to talk about the logistics of writing functions in C. As mentioned in the last session, there are three main parts we need to focus on when we're talking about writing functions. The first is being able to write the function itself. The second is being able to write a prototype for that function, and we'll talk about what that means in a minute. And then we need to be able to actually call the function so that it can do its assigned task. We're going to start by looking at what's required to write a function in C. There are three main things that we have to include in every single C function that we write. The first is the declaration statement, and this is the very first line of a function that identifies what its name is and exactly what information will be passed into the function for it to use and what information will be generated and passed out of the function for other functions to use. The second part are the local variables. So these are any variables that we're going to need in order to do this task. And finally, we need to provide the body, which is the actual instructions that are going to do the task. Let's take a look at the basic layout of a function. First, we can see the declaration line. It always comes first. It's got three parts: a return type, a function name, and parameter list that we'll talk about in a minute. Then we have open and close brackets that enclose both our variables and the actual instructions. Now we'll look at each of those independently. Let's start with the function declaration. As we recall, it defines two things: the name of the function and the type of information coming in and out. So let's dissect it. First, we can see the return data type. What this is going to do is it's going to tell us what information is going to get passed back and made available to the calling function. So if we look at our example down here, we can see that this particular function is going to return a floating point number to whatever function called it. That means that the calling function is going to be able to use this value. Next comes the function name. Remember from the last video that it should be both a verb and a noun together, and it should really carefully describe what that function is going to do. Here we can see our function name. It's called getCelsius. So that implies we're going to get something from the user because of the keyword get, and what we're going to get is something in Celsius. So Celsius implies a temperature. So we're going to get a temperature in Celsius that we are going to return back to the calling function. The third part is the parameter list, and this is where we pass in any information that our function is going to need to do its job. So in our sample down here, we can see we've passed in two floating point numbers, one called low and one called high. These two variables that are local to the getCelsius function are going to provide us limits so that we can check our data so that it's between our established low limit and high limit. After the function declaration come the function variables, and these are the local variables that are going to be available to us while this particular function is active, not after, but just during. Anything that we need in order to complete this particular task should be declared right inside this particular function. And the way we're going to do that is by specifying its data type, just like any other declaration, followed by the variable names. We can do one per line, in which case our terminator would follow that first variable name, or we can, if they're the same data type, string them together using a comma separator. So let's take a look at some examples here. We can see we have a floating point number and we have an integer. The variable names, we have tempC and OK. And we have one defined per line, so we have tempC declared on one, OK declared on another, but this one we have also initialized at the same time. Important to remember that each line has to be terminated with a semicolon. Finally, we have the most important part, the function body, and it's here that we're going to specify all the instructions in the correct order that we need to do the particular task. We're also going to specify any values that we want returned to the calling function here. So let's take a look down here. Here we have an input function, and we have a typical loop. We have a do-while loop. We're looping until, or we're looping while it's not okay. We're prompting and reading input from the user. We're checking it, printing a message if it's out of range. Otherwise, we're setting our flag OK equal to true. And once that becomes true, we'll fall out of our loop and do the final, the return part, where we're going to return the value that the user entered up here. So let's take a look at the whole function. First, we can see the function declaration. Then we can see our variable declarations. And finally, the two parts of our body. The first to do the actual work, and the second to return values. The thing we haven't mentioned up to this point, and very important to include, are the opening brace and the closing brace that mark the beginning and the end of our function. Now that we have our function written, it's time to look at the other two parts, defining the prototype and making the actual call. The prototype for a C function is not used in the actual execution of the code, but it's information for the compiler. And what it does is it identifies three things to the compiler. First, that there's going to be a function by this particular name. It tells what information is going to be passed in and out of that function, and more importantly, it allows that function to be called from main, for example, before the actual function body shows up in the code. So it's really information for the compiler and not for us as programmers. In terms of what it looks like, it's very similar to our declaration. So we can see the return type, the function name, and the parameter list. The only difference between the actual declaration and the function prototype is the terminator that has to be at the end. So let's take a look at our example. Here's our floating point return value. There's our function name. Here's our parameter list with our low and high limits. And there's that terminator. Now that the function has been written and prototyped, we're ready to call it. And there are a couple of rules that we have to keep in mind when we call a function. The first is we have to use its actual name. We have to specify the parameters exactly in the order that is written in the parameter list in the declaration. And if there's a return value, we have to remember to assign it. So let's take a look at an example here. We have our function name. There's our getCelsius. We have our parameter list. There are our parameters. And we have our return value assigned. So here we're assigning the returned value of what's on the right-hand side of our expression to temp C, which is our variable on the left-hand side. Important to remember that just like every other instruction, it has to be terminated with a semicolon. Now that we've talked about all three parts, let's look at where they would show up in actual code. So here we can see a header for a function. Then we have our inclusion of our libraries, and then we have our constants. So here are the high and low values that we're going to use in our program. Notice I've defined them the two different possible ways here. In a program, you would usually use one or the other, but not both, but I've included both here so that you can see them. We have the traditional number define. Low is our constant name, and we're defining it as minus 40.0 float. And the other way is to use the const, C-O-N-S-T keyword, floating point number. High is the name of it, and it's assigned 40.0f. Now, more importantly, here is our prototype. Floating point return value, the name of the function, the parameter list, and the terminator. Now here, I've repeated the parameter list just so we have it as a reference. But what's more important here is what's in main. So here we've defined a variable called temp, floating point number, and here's our call to our function, get Celsius. Our parameter list uses the low and high that are the two constants we have. So it's going to get input from the user and it's going to assign it to the variable called temp. Then in the next line we're going to print the temperature is our calculated value, and there's a calculation right there. So it's going to print the user inputted value in Celsius, convert it to Fahrenheit, and print it. Then finally we're going to see the function itself. So there's our declaration line. There are our local variables. Here's our block of code that does the work. And there's the return value back to the calling function. So when we're writing functions, we would write the function first, including the declaration, the local variables, the instructions themselves, and any return values. Then we would define the prototype, which is exactly the same as the declaration line with a terminating semicolon. And finally, we can call that function anytime we need that task to be executed.